Once upon a time, there lived a king and a queen who had almost everything they could possibly wish for. But neither was content, for there was one thing missing. They both wanted a child. One day, the queen saw a rosebud floating in the fountain, and it smelled so sweet. She put her hand in to pull it out. Just then, a bright green frog leaped out of the water and spoke to her. "Don't be afraid," he said. "I have good news for you. Before long, you will have a baby girl." And he jumped back into the water with a tiny splash. The queen was overjoyed and ran straight inside to tell the king what had happened. The following spring, just as the frog had promised, a beautiful little girl was born, and the palace bustled with joy. The king and queen were so delighted that they decided to celebrate with a magnificent party. "Everyone in the kingdom will be invited," said the king, beaming with pride. In those days, it was the custom when a royal baby was born to send out invitations to all the fairies in the realm, from the tiniest to the most powerful. Messengers were sent out all over the land. But one fairy, who had not been seen for more than 50 years, was forgotten, and she was the oldest and most powerful of all. Her name was Malvola. "So they don't want me at the party," she snarled. "Well, let's see if they like my gift." On the day of the party, the king and queen welcomed the fairies as they arrived and led them all to the beautiful hall, full of flowers. "The princess's name is Rosebud," announced the king as the fairies came forward to give their magical gifts. "Then she will be as beautiful as a rose," said the first fairy. "Everyone will love her," said another. "She will be very clever," promised a third. "Kind, graceful, lucky in love." As they went on, the queen began to lose count of all the wonderful gifts showered upon little Rosebud, sleeping sweetly in her arms. All of a sudden, the air grew freezing cold, and at the entrance to the hall was Malvola, hidden in shadow. "You didn't ask me to the party, but I've come anyway," she cried. "Here is my gift. Beautiful and clever she may be, but when she is 16, the princess will prick her finger on a spindle and die." The other fairies shrieked with horror, and the queen held her precious baby close, but Malvola had already disappeared into the night. Just then, a tiny fairy with a wand that shone like pink fire flew out of the shadows and hovered above the little princess. "I haven't given my gift," she said. The queen lifted her baby up to the fairy. "When you prick your finger, you shall not die, Rosebud," said the fairy. "You will fall into a deep sleep until 100 years have passed, when a prince will wake you." The king and queen wept as the fairy said goodbye. What a terrible future for their little princess. The king was determined to beat the evil spell. The next day, he ordered that every spindle in his kingdom be burned on a huge fire. The little fairy, who had stayed behind to keep watch over the princess, shook her head and whispered, "What's done cannot be so easily undone." Years passed, and the king and queen began to believe that they had outwitted Malvola. Rosebud grew as beautiful and clever and as kind as the fairies had promised. She was as graceful as a deer and so loving no one ever wished a moment's harm. But the little fairy waited and watched over her with an anxious heart. On the morning of her 16th birthday, Rosebud woke up feeling strangely restless. She wandered from room to room and soon found herself in a part of the palace she had never seen before. Excitedly, she climbed faster and faster up the steps of an old tower until she reached the door at the top. It opened at the lightest touch. There in front of her was an old woman working at a spinning wheel. Rosebud had never seen a spindle before, and it all seemed like magic. "What are you doing?" she asked. "Can I try?" "If you like," smiled the old woman, taking Rosebud's hand. But as soon as Rosebud touched the spindle, the sharp needle pricked her finger and she fell at once to the ground in a deep sleep. "See, you can't escape from my spell," hissed the old lady, for she was Malvola in disguise, and then triumphantly she slipped away. Luckily, the little fairy was already searching for the princess. She warned the king and queen, and they hurried over to the tower. There they found Rosebud fast asleep by the spinning wheel. All day they wept and called her name, gently touching her face and rubbing her hands. But it was no use. Rosebud remained asleep, smiling prettily as though she was dreaming. At last, with a heavy heart, the king carried Rosebud to her room and laid her on her bed. Then it was time for the little fairy to carry out what she had been planning ever since Melvola cast her evil spell. Gently, she touched the king and queen, who yawned and soon sank quietly into a deep sleep. One by one, the fairy touched the cooks, and the corridors, and the pages, and the maids, until the whole palace was quiet except for the sound of gentle breathing. Even the cats and dogs slept, the mice in the corn, the doves in the hayloft. Outside in the gardens, the wild roses quickly began to grow, and huge briars covered the walls of the palace. Days passed, weeks, months, and then years. Still the palace slept deep in enchantment, encircled by a forest of wild roses. In the outside world, a legend grew of a princess cursed by a wicked fairy. Everyone agreed that there were great treasures to be found in her palace, but that it was unlucky to go anywhere near it. Some, braver than the rest, tried to hack through the briars, but at every stroke of their swords, the thorns grew black, thicker, and they gave up, scratching and bleeding, and slunk back home. Almost 100 years had passed when a young prince went out riding in the forest. Prince Florizel soon found himself separated from his friends, with no idea where he was. With growing excitement, he saw that he must be near the enchanted palace of the legend. Through the trees was a vast wall of wild roses, and their scent flowered around him like honey, drawing him closer. He jumped from his horse and raised his sword, ready to fight his way through. But to Floril's amazement, the thorns melted away and the roses parted in front of him. Soon the huge stone walls of the palace loomed above him, overgrown with brambles and moss. Florizel saw a watchman on guard and held his breath until he heard snoring. The man was fast asleep. Florizel crept forward, past guards in the guard chambers and the horses asleep as they stood. Cooks slept in the middle of stirring their pans, and children lay curled up, their toys still clutched in their hands. As if in a dream, Florizel climbed the cobwebby stairs until he came upon a door and pushed it open. The most beautiful princess he had ever seen lay on the bed asleep. Florizel leaned forward and kissed her hand, and her eyes fluttered and opened. "My prince," she said sweetly, "I've been dreaming about you. I knew you would come." And before they knew it, the prince and Rosebud were talking and laughing as if they had known each other their whole lives. Meanwhile, the palace had also woken up, and everyone was getting back to whatever they had been doing when they went to sleep. The dogs were chasing the cats, the sparrows were pecking at crumbs, the stable boy was leading out the horses, and the cooks were getting the kitchens ready for supper. The king and queen soon discovered that the spell on their daughter had been broken, and they wept tears of joy. Not long after, it was announced that Prince Florizel and Princess Rosebud were to be married. Everyone in the kingdom was invited to that magnificent wedding in the palace rose garden. Rosebud wore an exquisite silk wedding dress. As she walked by, fairies showered her with fragrant petals. Never had she looked more beautiful than when she looked into the eyes of her handsome prince, and smiling, each said, "I do." It was the happiest day of their lives, and celebrations lasted well into the night. The princess, who became known as Sleeping Beauty, and the prince lived happily ever after, forever grateful for the magic of the little fairy.